Good day, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the Unit 1, which is the preliminary concepts and recent trends in EDUC 202 Assessment in Learning 1. Let's start. Assessment is the process of gathering evidences of students' performance over a period of time to determine learning and mastery of skills. It is a fact-finding activity that describes condition that exists at a particular time. Assessment often involves measurement to gather data. However, it is the domain of assessment to organize the measurement data into interpretable forms on a number of variables. As we go along, I'll be discussing to you the outline of the discussion for the lesson 1, which is what is educational assessment. The lesson 2 is common terminologies. Number 3, high quality assessment. And last, recent trends and focus. Assessment in educational setting may describe the progress students have made towards a given educational goal at a point in time. However, it is not concerned with the explanation of the underlying reasons and does not proffer recommendations for actions, although there may be some implied judgment as to the satisfactories or otherwise of the situation. These are the objectives that we need to accomplish for this period. At the end of this unit, you are expected to explain the basic concepts and principles in educational assessment, discuss on the role of assessment in making instructional decisions to improve teaching and learning, and you're going to reflect on and discuss the applications and implications of assessment to teaching and learning. In the classroom, assessment refers to all the processes and products which are used to describe the nature and the extent of pupils' learning. This also takes cognizance of the degree of correspondence of such learning with the objectives of instruction. Some educationists, in contrasting assessment with evaluation, opine that while evaluation is generally used when the subject is not persons or group of persons, but the effectiveness or otherwise of a course or program of teaching or method of teaching, assessment is used generally for measuring or determining personal attributes. It is the totality of the student, the environment of learning, and the student's accomplishment. A number of instruments are often used to measurement data from various sources. This includes tests, aptitude tests, inventories, questionnaires, observation schedules, etc. All these sources give data which are organized to show evidence of change and the direction of that change. A test is thus one of the assessment instruments. It is the use in getting quantitative data. For the lesson 1, which is what is educational assessment? These are the basic principles. Number 1, assessment should be valid. Validity ensures that assessment task and associated criteria effectively measure student attainment of the intended learning outcomes at the appropriate level. The second one, assessment should be reliable and consistent. There is a need for assessment to be reliable, and this requires clear and consistent processes for the setting, marking, grading, and moderation of assignments. Number 3, information about assessment should be explicit, accessible, and transparent. Clear, accurate, consistent, and timely information on assessment tasks and procedures should be made available to students, staff, and other external assessors or examiners. Number 4, assessment should be inclusive and equitable as far as is possible without compromising academic standards. Inclusive and equitable assessment should ensure that tasks and procedures do not disadvantage any group or individual. Number five, assessment should be an integral part of program design and should relate directly to the program aims and learning outcomes. Assessment tasks should primarily reflect the nature of the discipline or subject, but should also ensure that students have the opportunity to develop a range of generic skills and capabilities. Number six, the amount of assessed work should be manageable. The scheduling of assignments and the amount of assessed work required should provide a reliable and valid profile of achievement without overloading staff or students. Number seven, formative and summative assessments should be included in each program. Formative and summative assessment should be incorporated into programs to ensure that the purposes of assessment are adequately addressed. 8. Timely feedback that promotes learning and facilitates improvement should be an integral part of the assessment process. Students are entitled to feedback on summative or submitted formative assessment tasks and on summative tasks where appropriate. The nature, extent, and timing of feedback for each assessment task should be made clear to students in advance. Number 9, staff development policy and strategy should include assessment. All those involved in the assessment of students must be competent to undertake their roles and responsibilities. Types of assessment. Assessment is integral to the teaching learning process, facilitating student learning and improving instruction, and can take a variety of forms. Classroom assessment is generally divided into three types. Number one, assessment for learning. It's an ongoing process. Assessment of learning, that is the end of each lesson, and assessment as learning. The students could reflect what they have learned regarding the lessons that they've tackled. Let's talk about assessment for learning, the formative assessment. Assessment for learning is ongoing assessment that allows teachers to monitor students on a day-to-day basis and modify their teaching based on what the students need to be successful. This assessment provides students with the timely, specific feedback that they need to make adjustments to their learning. The philosophy behind assessment for learning is that assessment and teaching should be integrated into a whole. The power of such an assessment doesn't come from intricate technology or from using a specific assessment instrument. It comes from recognizing how much learning is taking place in the common tasks of the school day and how much insight into student learning teachers can mine from this material. Let's now move on to assessment of learning, which is the summative assessment. Assessment of learning refers to strategies designed to confirm what students know, demonstrate whether or not they have met curriculum outcomes or the goals of their individualized programs, or to certify proficiency and make decisions about students' future programs or placements. In other words, it is designed to provide evidence of achievement to parents, other educators, the students themselves, and sometimes to outside groups like employers, other educational institutions. So, effective assessment of learning requires that teachers provide a rationale for undertaking a particular assessment of learning at a particular point in time. There should be clear descriptions of the intended learning process that make it possible for students to demonstrate their competence and skill. A range of alternative mechanisms for assessing the same outcomes. Public and defendable references points for making judgments. Table 1, it shows the comparison between assessment for learning and assessment of learning. In the first column, assessment for learning, that is formative assessment, it says here, it checks learning to determine what to do next and then provide suggestions of what to do. Teaching and learning are indistinguishable from assessment. While in the assessment of learning, it is designed for the information of those not directly involved in daily learning and teaching, like the school administration, parents, school board, Alberta education, post-secondary institutions, in addition to educators and students. While in assessment for learning, it is continually by providing descriptive feedback to learners. In assessment of learning, it is presented in a periodic report. Assessment for learning, again, it is usually uses detailed, specific, and descriptive feedback in a form or informal report, while in assessment of learning, usually compiles data into a single number, score, or mark as part of a formal report. And the rest, you may review them, you may just read them, or try to search other relevant sources. Next is assessment as learning. Assessment as learning develops and supports students' metacognitive skills. This form of assessment is crucial in helping students become lifelong learners. As students engage in peer and self-assessment, they learn to make sense of information, relate it to prior knowledge, and use it for new learning. In other words, students develop a sense of ownership and efficacy when they use teacher, peer, and self-assessment feedback to make adjustments, improvements, and changes to what they understand. Through this process, students are able to learn about themselves as learners and become aware of how they learn, become metacognitive, knowledge of one's own thought process. Students also reflect on their own work on a regular basis, usually through self and peer assessment, and decide, often with the help of the teacher, particularly in the early stages, what their next learning will be. Assessment as learning helps students to take more responsibility for their own learning and monitoring future decisions. Let's talk about the four general purposes of assessment. Number one, instructional assessments. Assessment used to modify and adapt instruction to meet students' needs. It can be an informal or formal assessment and usually takes place within the context of a classroom. Informal assessment or informal instructional assessments can include teacher questioning strategies or reviewing classroom work. A formal instructional assessment could be a written pre-test in which a teacher uses the results to analyze what the students already know before determining what to teach. Example, quiz on reading assignment. Number two is diagnostic assessments. Assessment used to determine a student's academic, cognitive, or behavioral strengths and weaknesses. These assessments provide a comprehensive picture of a student's overall functioning and go beyond exclusively focusing on academic achievement. Example, assessment to identify a student for special education or English language services. Number three is predictive assessment. Assessment used to determine the likelihood that a student or school will meet a particular predetermined goal. One common type of predictive assessment used by schools and districts is a benchmark or interim assessment, which is designed primarily to determine which students are on track for meeting end-of-year achievement goals. Example, interim reading assessment to determine whether a student is on track to pass the state reading assessment required under the Title 1A. Number four is evaluative assessments. Assessment used to determine the outcome of a particular curriculum, program, or policy. The results are often compared to a predetermined goal or objective. This assessment, unlike diagnostic or predictive assessments, are not necessarily designed to provide actionable information on students or schools. Example, state reading, mathematics, and science assessments. As we move on in lesson 2, which is the common terminologies, number one term is measurement. So, measurement is the process of determining or describing the attributes or characteristics of physical objects, generally in terms of quantity. When we measure, we use some standard instrument to find out how long, heavy, hot, voluminous, cold, fast, or straight some things are. In the field of education, however, the quantities and qualities of interest are abstract, unseen, and cannot be touched, and so the measurement process becomes difficult. Hence, the need to specify the learning outcomes to be measured. For example, knowledge of the subject matter is often measured through standardized test results. In this case, the measuring procedure is testing. Another term is testing. It is an instrument of assessment. A test or quiz is used to examine someone's knowledge of something to determine what he or she knows or has learned. It is an assessment tool that reflects the records of the student's learning outcomes. Testing measures the level of skill or knowledge that has been reached. A standardized test is any form of test that requires all test takers to answer the same questions or a selection of questions from common bank of questions. In the same way, and that is scored in a standard or consistent manner, which makes it possible to compare the relative performance of individual students or groups of students. In addition to the familiar multiple choice format, standardized tests can include true or false questions, short answer questions, essay questions, or a mix of types questions. While standardized tests were traditionally presented on paper and completed using pencils, and many still are, they are increasingly being administered on computers connected to online programs. The third one is evaluation. It originates from the root word value, as so when we evaluate, we expect our process to give information regarding the worth, appropriateness, goodness, validity, or legality of something for which a reliable measurement has been made. It is a process designed to provide information that will help us to make a judgment about a particular situation. Objects of evaluation include instructional programs, school projects, teachers, students, and educational goals. Examples are correlation between achievement test results and diagnostic test results, attributes of an effective teacher, Education for All, project of a district, and the comparative effectiveness of two remedial reading programs. Evaluation involves data collection and analysis and quantitative and qualitative methods. It helps educators determine the academic success of their academic programs and signal efforts to improve students' achievement. It can also help identify the success factors in programs and projects. Let's now move on to types of tests. Number one is achievement tests. These are designed to measure knowledge and skills students learn in school or to determine the academic progress they have made over a period of time. The test may also be used to evaluate the effectiveness of schools and teachers or identify the appropriate academic placement for a student. Example, what courses or programs may be deemed most suitable or what forms of academic support they may need. Achievement tests are backward looking in that they measure how well students have learned what they were expected to learn. Number two is aptitude tests. It attempts to predict a student's ability to succeed in an intellectual or physical endeavor by, for example, evaluating mathematical ability, language proficiency, abstract reasoning, motor coordination, or musical talent. Aptitude tests are for in that they typically attempt to forecast or predict how well students will do in a future educational or career setting. Aptitude tests are often a source of debate since many question their predictive accuracy and value. Number three is psychological tests, including IQ tests, are used to measure a person's cognitive abilities and mental, emotional, developmental, and social characteristics. Trained professionals such as school psychologists typically administer the test, which may require students to perform a series of tasks or solve a set of problems. Psychological tests are often used to identify students with learning abilities or other special needs that would qualify them for specialized services. Number four is placement test. These are used to place new students in the right class in a school. It assesses students' productive receptive skills and designed to show how good a student is in English in relation to previously agreed system of levels. Number five is diagnostic tests. Diagnostic tests are used to discover students' problems, difficulties, or deficiencies in a course. We use this type of test to know students' strengths and weaknesses so as to be able to do something about them. Number six is proficiency tests. These are not necessarily based on certain courses that students may have previously taken. Most students take this type of test to admit to a foreign university, get a job, or obtain some kind of certificate. Teachers design this to test to measure students' knowledge and ability in language. Last type of test is personality test. It is a method of assessing human personality constructs. Most personality instruments are in fact introspective. Example the subject, self-report, questionnaire, and rating scales. Let's now move on to lesson 3, which is the high quality assessment components. Let's now proceed with the clear and appropriate targets. Assessment can be made precise, accurate, and dependable only if what are to be achieved are clearly stated and feasible. It starts with a clear and appropriate learning target, which includes both what the students know and can do and the criteria for judging students' performance. The learning targets involving knowledge, reasoning, skills, performance, products, and effects need to be stated in behavioral terms, which denote something which can be observed through the behavior of the students. There are many benefits based on the existence of learnings that are clear and usable in order to build clear learning targets. Number one is knowledge targets. Begin with words like know, list, name, identify, recall. Procedural knowledge targets call for knowing how to do something. Number two is reasoning targets. Deal with the skillful use or application of knowledge. These targets start out with mental processes like predict, infer, classify, hypothesize, compare, conclude, summarize, etc. Number three, performance skills targets require the students to demonstrate their mastery of a learning targeted and to be observed. Number four, product targets. These are tangible and concrete evidence of students' ability. These are not used as frequently as other types, but are highly valued, calling for creation of a product. There is a need to specify the level of workmanship as expert, skilled, or novice. Five is dispositional targets. Rarely show up on state standards, but are important because they reflect students' attitudes about school and learning. These are the sources of learning targets. Number one is Bloom's taxonomy, that includes the cognitive and that talks about mental skills or the knowledge. Letter B, the psychomotor, the manual or physical skills. We're going to develop skills in this particular taxonomy. Letter C, affective, the growth in feelings or the attitude. We also have the national or regional and district standards. Also, we have textbooks. We're done with the clear targets. Let's now move on to appropriate methods. Letter A, we have written response instrument that includes the objective tests, essays, and checklists. When we are talking about objective tests, these are appropriate for assessing the various levels of hierarchy of educational objectives. The essays can test the student's grasp of the higher level cognitive skills. The checklist lists of several characteristics or activities presented to the subjects of a study where they will analyze and place mark opposite to the characteristics. Letter B, these are product rating scales. They are used to rate products like book reports, maps, charts, diagrams, notebooks, creative endeavors. They need to be developed to assess various products over the years. Letter C, performance test. Performance checklist consists of a list of behaviors that make up a certain type of performance. It is used to determine whether or not an individual behaves in a certain way when asked to complete a particular task. Next is oral questioning. It is appropriate assessment method when the objectives are to assess the student's stock knowledge on and or determine the student's ability to communicate ideas in coherent verbal sentences. Letter E, observation and self-reports. Useful supplementary methods when used in conjunction with oral questioning and performance tests. Let us now proceed with the adequate sampling. Sampling facilitates the assessment process when it is not feasible to assess all students. For example, when programs or courses have large number of students or when artifacts take a long time to review. The portion evaluated is the sample of the entire population. These are the sampling procedures before evaluating artifacts or data. Number one, decide whether you will use a sample or the whole population. Number two, choose an appropriate sample size based on percentage, artifact size, and complexity. Number three, choose an appropriate sampling method. These are the common types of sampling. Number one, simple random sampling. You randomly select a certain number of students or artifacts. Number two, stratified sampling. Students are sorted into homogeneous groups and then a random sample is selected from each group. This is useful when there are groups that may be underrepresented. Number three is systematic sampling. You select the nth term, example, the 7th, the 9th, the 20th student or artifact from a list. Number four is cluster sampling. You randomly select clusters or groups, example, classes or sections, and you evaluate the assignments of all the students in those randomly selected clusters or groups. Let us now move on to objectivity. When we are talking about objectivity, it refers to the removal of personal opinion, personal judgment, or personal bias in order to arrive at more precision. It is disputed how much this can be achieved in reality, as even the framing of the situation in which objectivity is desired, such as research project or an assessment, is subject to subjective influence. These are the purposes. Number one, to avoid bias. Number two, to ensure accurate conclusion or results. Number three, to ensure outcomes purely based on facts. These are the characteristics of objectivity. Number one, based on scientific facts rather than on one's opinion. Number two, they are factual, free from personal biases. Three, judgment based from observable phenomena and influenced by emotions or personal prejudices. Number four, being objective is to be clear or to do something that is not primary about oneself. Five, has multi-dimensional viewing. Number six, its results and data is based on continuous testing, then demonstrated or confirmed by a third party. Conclusion, in educational assessment, objectivity in scoring and interpretation of test items is a very crucial element to be considered. Objectivity of scoring means same person or different persons scoring the test at any time arrives at the same result without any chance error. Let's now move on to accountability. Assessments generate information and, depending on the nature and use of the information obtained, can play multiple roles in education. Accountability involves using some of this information to generate incentives to validate or change the behaviors of students and educators. When assessments are aligned with learning goals, accountability systems can motivate classroom instruction to focus on those outcomes. Thus, policymakers and educators in many states view assessment linked with accountability as a powerful strategy for ensuring that all students are held to the same set of high standards. In the field of education, there are three main types of accountability system. Letter A, compliance with regulations. Compliance systems view the school as the embodiment of constant processes and allow for variation in results generally attributed to the varying characteristics of students. Simply stated, educators were accountable for adherence to rules and accountable to the bureaucracy. Letter B, adherence to professional norms. Within this system, educators are accountable for adherence to standards and accountable to their peers. Letter C, results driven. The third accountability system is based upon results, with the results defined in terms of student learning. In these systems, educators are accountable for student learning and accountable to the general public. Let's talk about fairness in recent trends and focus. Fairness refers to the consideration of learners' needs and characteristics, and any reasonable adjustments that need to be applied to take account of them. It is important to ensure that the learner is informed about, understands, and is able to participate in the assessment process and agrees that the process is appropriate. There are three imperatives that support fairness in educational assessment. Number one is democratic. While examinations have not historically always been fair or democratic in intent or consequence, a democratic imperative for fairness in assessment has evolved from the tradition of selection by examination. Number two is measurement. The quality of information that assessments provide is affected by stakeholders' perceptions of fairness. Students' perceptions influence their motivation in the assessment process, their degree of engagement, and thus the degree to which they demonstrate learning. Number three is pedagogical. The beliefs and knowledge that teachers and students bring to teaching and learning interact with different elements of fairness. The fairness of classroom assessment, regardless of purpose, is affected by classroom relationships and interactions, which in turn influences the learning environment. For an assessment to be fair, it must measure a student's ability in the subject they have studied, effectively differentiate student performance, ensure no student is disadvantaged, including those who speak English as a second language, must give all students the same opportunity to achieve the right grade, irrespective of which exam series they take or which examiner marks their paper. Part of the recent trends in focus is standard-based education. Standards-based education refers to systems of instruction, assessment, grading, and academic reporting that are based on students demonstrating understanding or mastery of the knowledge and skills they are expected to learn as they progress through their education. The general goal of standards-based learning is to ensure that students are acquiring the knowledge and skills that are deemed to be essential to success in school, higher education, careers, and adult life. Also part is the outcomes-based education. The change in educational perspective is called outcomes-based education or the what we call OBE. It focuses on classroom instruction on the skills and competencies that students must demonstrate when they exit. These are the characteristics of outcomes-based education. Number one, it is student-centered. It places the students at the center of the process by focusing on student learning outcomes or the SLO. Number two, it is faculty-driven. It encourages faculty responsibility for teaching, assessing program, outcomes, and motivating participation from the students. Number three, it is meaningful. It provides data to guide the teacher in making valid and continuing improvement in instruction and assessment activities. Procedure in implementing outcomes-based education on the subject or course. Number one, identification of educational objectives of the subject course. Educational objectives are the broad goals that the subject course expects to achieve and defining, in general terms, the knowledge, skill, and attitude that the teacher will help the students to attain. The objectives are stated from the point of view of the teacher, such as to develop, to provide, to enhance, etc. Two is listing of learning outcomes specified for each subject or course objective. Learning outcomes are stated as concrete, active, detailed guides such as to demonstrate, to explain, to differentiate, to illustrate, etc. A good source of learning outcome statements is the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives by Benjamin Bloom, the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective. The last one is drafting outcomes assessment procedure. This procedure will enable the teacher to determine the degree to which the students are attaining the desired learning outcomes. It identifies for every outcome the data that will be gathered, which will guide the selection of the assessment tools to be used and at what point assessment will be done. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned a lot in our topic today. So these are my references, the internet sources, link. Have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.